first note left her throat and disappeared into the night sky, swallowed by the indifferent city below, and that was exactly why Thea Vance climbed 7 flights of rusted fire escape stairs to sing where no one could tell her to stop. Midnight had become her stage. The rooftop of her crumbling apartment building, stretched out in cracked concrete and forgotten potted plants, lit only by the distant glow of streetlights and the occasional flicker of a neon sign from the bodega 2 blocks over. She sat on the ledge with her legs dangling over the edge, her worn sneakers swaying in empty air, and sang because here, at least, her voice belonged to her. During the day, she was invisible. At the coffee shop where she worked, customers looked through her as if she were made of glass. Her manager snapped orders without meeting her eyes. Her coworkers talked over her in the break room, their conversations flowing around her like water around a stone. At community college, she sat in the back of lecture halls and raised her hand, only to have professors call on someone else. Even her roommate, a nursing student named Becca, who spent most nights at her boyfriend's place, barely acknowledged her existence beyond the occasional grunt when rent was due. So Thea sang to the city instead. She sang old folk songs her grandmother had taught her before she died. She sang pop songs from the radio, stripped down and rearranged until they sounded like something fragile and true. She sang melodies that came to her in dreams, half-formed and haunting. Her voice wasn't perfect. She knew that. It cracked sometimes on the high notes, went breathy when she pushed too hard. But up here, alone, it didn't matter. Up here, she could be as loud or as soft as she wanted. She could make mistakes. She could experiment. She could exist. What she didn't know was that for the past 99 nights, she had not been alone. Thea finished a song and paused, pulling her jacket tighter against the October chill. The wind carried the smell of rain, though the sky remained stubbornly clear. She closed her eyes and tilted her head back, letting the cool air fill her lungs. Sometimes, in these quiet moments between songs, she felt a presence. Not threatening, exactly, just there. A weight to the darkness that shouldn't exist in an empty space. She'd convinced herself it was nothing, her imagination, loneliness manifesting as the sensation of being watched. After all, who would listen to her? Who would care enough to return night after night? She started another song, this one slower. A lullaby her grandmother used to hum while braiding her hair. The melody wound through the air like smoke, and Thea let herself get lost in it. This was the only place she felt real, the only place her voice mattered. Far below, the city hummed with its usual chaos. Sirens wailed in the distance. A car alarm bleated and then fell silent. Someone shouted something indistinct, their words lost in the urban sprawl. But up here, Thea existed in a pocket of stillness, a bubble of sound that was entirely hers. She didn't know that in the shadows of the adjacent building's rooftop, separated from her by a gap of perhaps 15 feet, stood a figure who had memorized every word she'd ever sung. Alaric Kovac, vampire king of the Eastern Territories, had not meant to become a fixture in this girl's life. He'd been walking the city's rooftops on a routine patrol, something he did when the weight of his court became too much, when the endless political maneuvering and ancient grudges made him crave the simplicity of movement and silence. He'd heard her voice that first night by accident, carried on the wind like a secret. He'd stopped, listened, and then, against every instinct that told him to move on, to not get involved with mortal affairs, he'd returned the next night, and the next, and the next. For 100 nights now, he had stood in the shadows and listened to this girl sing her heart out to an empty city. He knew the songs she favored when she was sad. He knew the ones she chose when she was angry, when she was lonely, when she was desperately trying to convince herself that tomorrow would be better. He'd heard her voice crack with tears. He'd heard it soar with unexpected joy. He'd heard every imperfect, beautiful note, and he had not spoken. Alaric Kovac did not do impulsive things. He was 600 years old, give or take a decade. He ruled the Eastern Territories with an iron will and an unshakable composure that his rivals found deeply unsettling. He did not form attachments to mortals. He did not indulge in sentiment. He certainly did not spend 100 consecutive nights listening to a human girl sing on a rooftop. Yet, here he was. The song she sang now was one of his favorites, though she didn't know he had favorites. Her voice wrapped around the melody with a gentleness that made something in his chest ache, a sensation he'd thought himself long immune to. He remembered when music had been allowed in his court, before the war, before the decree. The decree. Even thinking about it made his jaw tighten. 80 years ago, in the aftermath of a brutal conflict with a rival vampire faction, his council had pushed through a series of laws meant to distance their kind from mortal influence. Music, art, literature, anything born of human creativity had been deemed corrupting, weakness, a distraction from the purity of vampiric power. Alaric had been weakened from the war, still recovering from wounds that had nearly killed him, and he'd allowed the decree to pass. He'd told himself it was temporary, a concession to keep the peace, but 80 years had passed and the law remained. For 80 years, his court had existed in silence. No songs, no poetry, no paintings graced the walls of their underground halls. They had become exactly what the decree intended, cold, isolated, focused only on power and survival. And Alaric had buried the part of himself that loved music so deeply, he'd forgotten it existed. Until this girl reminded him. Thea finished the lullaby and sat in silence for a moment. Then she stood, stretched, and walked to the center of the rooftop. She usually sang for about an hour before heading back down. Alaric had learned her patterns. He knew she would sing 3 or 4 more songs, then disappear through the rooftop access door, and he wouldn't see her again until tomorrow night. Except tonight was the 100th night. He didn't know why that number felt significant, perhaps because 100 nights of anything demanded acknowledgement, perhaps because he was tired of watching from the shadows, perhaps because, for the first time in 8 decades, he was considering doing something that went against every careful, calculated instinct he'd honed over 6 centuries of existence. Thea started another song. This one was newer, something she'd been working on for the past week. He'd heard her stumble through it, refine it, find the right phrasing. But tonight, she got one of the lyrics wrong. A small thing. A substitution that changed the meaning of the verse just enough to bother him. Before he could stop himself, before he could think it through, Alaric spoke. The line is silver water, not silver morning. Thea's voice cut off mid-word. She spun around, her eyes wide, scanning the darkness. Who's there? For a moment, Alaric considered retreating, disappearing back into the shadows and pretending this had never happened. But he'd already spoken. The damage, if it could be called that, was done. He stepped forward into the faint light cast by the city below. He stood on the adjacent rooftop, separated from her by a gap and a low wall, close enough to see clearly, far enough to not seem threatening. Thea's hand flew to her chest. "Oh my God, you scared the hell out of me. My apologies." His voice was low, measured. He didn't apologize often, but this seemed to warrant it. She stared at him. He knew what she saw. White hair that fell past his shoulders, pulled back in a simple tie. Pale skin that looked carved from marble in the dim light. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in dark clothing that seemed to absorb the shadows around him. Eyes that caught the light strangely, reflecting it back like a cat's. "Have you been listening to me?" Her voice shook slightly, though he couldn't tell if it was from fear or something else. "Yes." The honesty seemed to surprise her. "For how long?" 100 nights. She blinked. "You're joking." "I do not joke." Thea took a step back, then seemed to reconsider and held her ground. That's kind of creepy, you know." "I am aware." He remained perfectly still, his hands at his sides, non-threatening. "I did not intend to alarm you. Your voice is extraordinary. I found myself unable to stay away." "Extraordinary?" She laughed, but it sounded bitter. "Right. That's why everyone at my job talks over me. Why my professors don't even remember my name. Why I have to come up here at midnight just to feel like I exist. They are fools." The certainty in his voice made her pause. She studied him more carefully now, her initial fear giving way to curiosity. "Who are you?" "My name is Alaric Kovac." Thea Vance. She wrapped her arms around herself. "So you've really been listening to me? For 100 nights?" "Every word, every note." "Why didn't you say anything before?" That was a more complicated question. Alaric was silent for a moment, considering his answer. "I did not want to intrude. Your songs seemed private, meant for yourself alone." "Then why speak up now? Because you changed the lyric. It alters the meaning of the verse. Despite herself, Thea smiled. You memorized my songs? All of them. She shook her head slowly, as if trying to process this information. That's insane. You know that's insane, right? Perhaps. He tilted his head slightly. Does it bother you, or that I've been listening? Thea considered this. She should probably be scared. A stranger admitting he'd been secretly listening to her for months should send her running. But there was something about the way he stood there, so still and formal, speaking to her with such serious intensity. And more than that, there was the simple fact that someone had actually heard her. Someone had cared enough to listen, to remember. I don't know, she admitted. It's weird, but also kind of nice. Is that messed up? I do not think so. An awkward silence fell between them. Thea shifted her weight from foot to foot. So what, you just hang out on rooftops listening to random people sing? Just you. The words hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning neither of them was quite ready to examine. Do you want to come over here? Thea asked suddenly. It's weird talking to you across a gap. Alaric hesitated. Crossing to her rooftop would be simple, a short jump barely worth his effort, but it would also be crossing a line, moving from observer to participant. Once he did that, there would be no going back to the comfortable distance he'd maintained. He jumped. The movement was so fast and fluid that Thea barely registered it. One moment he was on the adjacent building, the next he was landing soundlessly on a rooftop, straightening to his full height just a few feet away from her. How did you... She stared at the gap he'd just cleared. That's got to be 15 feet. Closer to 17. That's impossible. For a human, yes. The words settled over her like a cold blanket. Thea took a step back, her mind racing. His appearance suddenly made more sense. The white hair, the pale skin, the eyes that reflected light. The way he'd been able to stand in the shadows for 100 nights without her ever noticing. You're a vampire, she whispered. Yes. She should run. Every survival instinct in her body screamed at her to run, but she didn't. Instead, she asked, Are you going to hurt me? Never. The word was absolute, a vow. Why should I believe you? Because if I wanted to hurt you, I would have done so already. I've had 100 opportunities. It was a grim logic, but it was logic nonetheless. Thea let out a shaky breath. Okay, so you're a vampire who's been listening to me sing for 3 months. Why? I told you, your voice is extraordinary. But why does that matter to you? Alaric was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than before. My court has forbidden music for 80 years, along with all other mortal art forms. It was decreed during a time of war, meant to separate us from human influence. I allowed it to happen. I thought it would be temporary, but it became permanent. And I forgot what music could make me feel. Until I heard you. Thea's anger from earlier, the bitterness about being ignored, seemed to evaporate. She looked at this strange, formal vampire standing on her rooftop and saw something she recognized. Loneliness. The same ache she carried. That's awful, she said softly. Living without music. I did not realize how much I missed it until you reminded me. What's a vampire king doing wandering around the city alone anyway? Seeking respite from the weight of leadership. My court is complicated. I can't imagine what that's like, ruling people, having them depend on you. And I cannot imagine what it is like to be overlooked the way you are. He stepped slightly closer. You should be heard, you should be celebrated. Thea laughed, but it wasn't bitter this time. Just tired. That's a nice thought, but it doesn't really work that way for people like me. People like you. Invisible people. The ones everyone forgets about. I have not forgotten a single note you have sung. The intensity in his voice made her chest tighten. She looked up at him, really looked at him, and felt something shift inside her. This vampire king who'd stood in the shadows for 100 nights just to hear her sing, who spoke to her with such careful respect, who looked at her like she mattered. Will you sing again? He asked. Now that you know I'm listening? I don't know. It feels different now. How so? Before, it was just for me. Now it's for someone. Would that be so terrible? Thea thought about it. She'd spent so long being ignored that the idea of actually being heard, of mattering to someone, felt dangerous, like hoping for too much. But there was something about Alaric that made her want to be brave. "No," she said finally. "I guess it wouldn't." She walked back to the ledge and sat down, her legs dangling over the edge. After a moment's hesitation, Alaric joined her, maintaining a respectful distance. They sat in silence for a moment, looking out over the city. Then Thea began to sing. This time, the song was different, softer, more vulnerable. She sang knowing that someone was actually listening, that her voice was landing somewhere instead of disappearing into the void. It should have made her self-conscious, but instead it made her braver. She let her voice crack on the emotional notes. She held the high notes longer than she normally would. She sang like she meant it. When she finished, Alaric said quietly, "Thank you." "For what?" "For sharing that with me." They talked until almost 3 in the morning. Thea learned that Alaric had been born in the 14th century, somewhere in what was now Romania, that he'd become a vampire at 27 and had been ruling the Eastern Territories for over 300 years, that he read extensively, collected rare books, and missed the opera houses he used to frequent before the decree, that despite his power and position, he was profoundly lonely. Alaric learned that Thea was 22, studying communications at community college while working full-time at a coffee shop, that her parents had died in a car accident when she was 19 and her grandmother 6 months later, leaving her completely alone, that she'd always loved singing, but had been told by a middle school music teacher that her voice was acceptable but not exceptional, and she'd never quite recovered from that assessment, that she climbed to this rooftop every night because it was the only place she felt like herself. By the time Thea finally stood to leave, stretching her stiff legs, something had shifted between them. A connection formed. "Will you come back tomorrow?" Alaric asked. "Will you?" "I have for the past 100 nights. I do not intend to stop now." Thea smiled. It was a real smile, the kind that reached her eyes. "Then yeah, I'll be here." She disappeared through the rooftop access door, and Alaric stood alone in the pre-dawn darkness, wondering what exactly he'd just set in motion. Over the next 2 weeks, their midnight meetings became the focal point of both their lives. Thea would arrive at midnight, and Alaric would already be waiting. She'd sing, and he'd listen with an intensity that made her feel like the most important person in the world. Then they'd talk for hours about everything and nothing. Alaric told her about the intricacies of vampire politics, the ancient feuds and alliances that governed their world, about his council, a group of elder vampires who advised him and sometimes opposed him, about the decree and how much he'd grown to resent it. Thea told him about her dreams of maybe one day singing professionally, though she always framed it as an impossible fantasy, about the small humiliations of her daily life, about how invisible she felt, and how these midnight hours with him were starting to make her feel real again. "You should perform publicly," Alaric said one night. "Your voice deserves an audience." "Nobody would come." "I would." "You don't count. You're contractually obligated to like my singing after 100 nights." "There is no contract. I listen because I choose to. Because your voice is worth listening to." Thea looked down at her hands. "It's not that simple. I've tried before. Open mic nights, talent shows in high school, nobody cares. I'm forgettable." "You are not forgettable to me." The way he said it made her heart skip. Over the past 2 weeks, her feelings for Alaric had grown into something she wasn't quite ready to name. It was more than gratitude for his attention, more than the novelty of being heard. When she was with him, she felt safe, seen, valued, and the way he looked at her sometimes, with such intense focus, made her think maybe he felt something too. But he was a vampire king, ancient and powerful, and she was just a college student who worked at a coffee shop. The gap between them seemed insurmountable. "Tell me about the decree," she said, changing the subject. "Why hasn't anyone challenged it in 80 years? Alaric's expression darkened. "Because the vampires who pushed for it are still powerful members of my council. They believe mortal art forms weaken us, make us too sympathetic to humans. After the war, many in my kind wanted to separate ourselves completely from your world. The decree was a symbol of that separation." "But you don't agree with it." "I did not agree with it then, though I was too weak to fight it. I certainly do not agree with it now." "So repeal it." It is not that simple. The council would see it as a betrayal of our principles. There would be challenges to my authority, possibly another war. Is that what you're afraid of? War? I'm afraid of nothing. The words came out sharper than he intended. He softened his tone. But I am responsible for thousands of vampires who depend on my leadership. I cannot make decisions based solely on personal desire. Thea was quiet for a moment. Then she asked, "Do you think about it? Repealing the decree?" "More and more lately." "Because of me?" Alaric turned to look at her fully. "Yes, because of you." The air between them felt charged. Thea's pulse quickened, and she knew he could hear it, could probably smell the change in her blood chemistry, the physical response to his proximity. "Alaric," she said softly. "Yes? Why do you really keep coming back here?" He could have deflected, could have given her the same answer about her voice being extraordinary. But after 2 weeks of conversations that had grown progressively more intimate, more honest, he found he didn't want to hide anymore. "Because when I am with you, I remember what it feels like to want something for myself rather than for my court or my people. Because your voice woke something in me that I thought had died. Because in 600 years, I have never met anyone quite like you." Thea's breath caught. "I'm nothing special." "You are everything." He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and brushed a strand of hair from her face. His fingers were cool against her skin. "You're brave and true and entirely yourself, despite a world that tries to make you smaller. That is rare. That is precious." "I'm not brave. I hide on a rooftop. You sing your truth to the sky every night. That is the very definition of bravery." She leaned into his touch without thinking about it. "I think I'm falling for you. Is that stupid? If it is, then I'm equally foolish, because I have already fallen." He kissed her then, gentle and careful, as if she were something breakable. Thea kissed him back with all the emotion she'd been holding in, all the loneliness and longing and desperate need to be seen. His hand cupped her face, and she felt cherished in a way she'd never experienced before. When they finally pulled apart, both slightly breathless, Alaric rested his forehead against hers. "This complicates things," he said quietly. "I know. My world is dangerous. There are vampires who would see you as a weakness to exploit. Are you trying to scare me away? I'm trying to be honest with you. If we continue this, if we allow this to become what it wants to become, your life will change. You will be pulled into politics and dangers you cannot imagine." Thea pulled back enough to look him in the eyes. "And if we don't continue this, if we walk away right now, then I will spend the rest of my immortal existence regretting it. Then I guess we don't walk away." From that night forward, their relationship shifted. They were no longer just a vampire and a girl who met on a rooftop. They were something more, something neither of them fully understood, but both were willing to explore. Alaric began arriving earlier in the evenings, before midnight. They'd walk the city together, Alaric showing her the hidden places only vampires knew about, speakeasies that had operated since Prohibition, now serving blood to vampire clientele, gardens hidden in the hearts of abandoned buildings, rooftop paths that connected half the city if you knew the right jumps. Thea started staying later into the night, sometimes not getting home until dawn was threatening. Becca, the few times she was actually at the apartment, noticed something was different, but didn't ask questions. Thea's manager at the coffee shop commented that she seemed distracted lately, but Thea found she didn't care. For the first time in years, her real life felt like it was happening outside of work and school. Her real life was happening at midnight, with a vampire who looked at her like she hung the moon. But reality couldn't be avoided forever. 3 weeks after their first kiss, Alaric arrived at the rooftop looking troubled. Thea noticed immediately. "What's wrong?" "The council has requested my presence at a formal session tomorrow night. They have concerns about my recent absences from court." "You haven't told them about me." "No, and I do not intend to, not yet." "Why not?" Alaric sat down on the ledge, and Thea joined him. "Because the moment I tell them about you, you become a political tool. They will either try to use you to control me or eliminate you to remove my distraction. I will not allow either outcome." Fear flickered through Thea's chest. "Eliminate me? You mean kill me?" "They would not dare, not while I draw breath, but the threat would exist, and I will not put you in that position." "So what do we do?" I attend the council session. I placate them. I buy us time to figure out how to navigate this without putting you at risk. I don't want you to have to choose between me and your responsibilities." Alaric took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "You are not asking me to choose, but eventually I will have to make decisions about how to integrate you into my life in a way that keeps you safe. That will require careful planning. What if there's no safe way? Then I will make one." The absolute certainty in his voice should have comforted her, but Thea couldn't shake the feeling that they were building something beautiful on unstable ground. The next night, Alaric didn't come to the rooftop. Thea waited until 2 in the morning before finally accepting that he wasn't going to show. She tried not to feel hurt. He'd told her about the council session, but after weeks of seeing him every night, his absence felt like a physical ache. She sang anyway, though her heart wasn't in it. The songs felt hollow without him there to listen. What Thea didn't know was that Alaric's council session had gone far worse than he'd anticipated. The council chamber existed deep beneath the city, carved from stone centuries ago. 12 elder vampires sat in a semicircle, and Alaric stood before them, his expression carefully neutral. "Your absences have been noted," said Cassius, the eldest of the council, and the vampire who'd first proposed the decree 80 years ago. He was ancient even by vampire standards, his white hair and pale skin almost translucent. "You spend your nights roaming the city like a common vagrant rather than attending to court business." "I'm attending to court business," Alaric replied calmly, "patrolling the territory, ensuring our security." "Security." Cassius said the word like it tasted bad. "We have soldiers for security. You are a king. Your place is here, governing." "I govern quite effectively. The territories are stable, our alliance is strong, our enemies kept at bay. My methods are unconventional but successful." Another council member, a female vampire named Morgana, leaned forward. "There are rumors, my king. Whispers that you have been seen in the company of a human." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Alaric kept his expression blank. "I interact with humans regularly. It is unavoidable when one lives in a modern city." "This is different," Morgana pressed. "They say you return to the same location every night, that you meet with the same human, a girl." "Gossip and speculation." "Then you deny it?" Alaric could lie, should lie, but something in him rebelled at the idea of denying Thea's existence, of pretending she meant nothing. "I do not see how my private activities concern the council, provided they do not interfere with my duties." The admission hung in the air. Cassius's eyes narrowed. "So you do not deny it. You have formed an attachment to a mortal. This is exactly the kind of weakness the decree was meant to prevent." "The decree," Alaric said, his voice hardening, "was meant to be a temporary measure during wartime. It has overstayed its purpose." The room erupted. Council members began speaking over each other, their voices rising. Morgana slammed her hand on the stone armrest of her chair, calling for order. "You cannot mean to challenge the decree," Cassius said when silence finally fell. "It has been law for 80 years. It defines us, separates us from the mortals we feed upon." "It has made us cold," Alaric countered, "isolated. We have lost our connection to beauty, to culture, to everything that makes existence worth continuing beyond mere survival." "Sentiment," Cassius spat. "This is what comes from consorting with humans. They infect you with their weakness. Or perhaps they remind us of our strength. We were not always as we are now. There was a time when our kind valued art and music and literature. And we were weaker for it. The war proved that. The war proved that we were unprepared for betrayal, not that beauty made us weak." The argument continued for hours. By the time Alaric left the council chamber, nothing had been resolved, but battle lines had been drawn. The council now knew he was questioning the decree. They knew he'd formed an attachment to a human, and they would be watching. When Alaric finally made it to Thea's rooftop the following night, she was already there, sitting on the ledge with her knees pulled to her chest. "You didn't come yesterday," she said without looking at him. "I'm sorry. The council session lasted until dawn." "That bad?" "They know about you. Not who you are, but that you exist. That I have been meeting with a human regularly." Thea's stomach dropped. "What did they say?" Alaric sat beside her and recounted the session. When he finished, Thea was quiet for a long moment. "Maybe we should stop," she said finally. "If being with me is going to cause problems for you, maybe it's not worth it." "Do not say that." His voice was sharp. "Do not ever say that. Alaric, I don't want to be the reason your council turns against you. The council has been turning against itself for decades. You are not the cause of our dysfunction. If anything, you have made me realize how deep that dysfunction runs." He took her hand. "I will not give you up to appease vampires who have forgotten why immortality is worth having." "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to repeal the decree." Thea stared at him. "You can't. You said it would cause another war." "It might. Or it might force my council to confront how much we have lost in the name of purity. Either way, it is time. You're doing this because of me. I'm doing this because it is right. You simply help me see that. Alaric, I'm not worth starting a war over." He turned to face her fully, his expression intense. "You are worth that and more. But this is not just about you. This is about the kind of king I want to be, the kind of court I want to rule. I have spent 80 years allowing fear and tradition to dictate law. No more." "When?" "The next full council session, 2 weeks from tonight." Thea's mind raced. 2 weeks. In 2 weeks, Alaric would challenge a law that had stood for 8 decades, and she would be the reason why. The weight of that responsibility felt crushing. What if they refuse? What if they vote against you? "Then I will overrule them. I am king. The council advises, but ultimate authority rests with me. They have forgotten that in recent decades. It is time to remind them." "You sound different, more certain?" "Yeah," Alaric smiled slightly. "I've spent too long second-guessing myself, trying to maintain peace at the cost of progress. You have reminded me what it means to be brave, to fight for what matters. I'm not brave. You are the bravest person I have ever met. You exist authentically in a world that tells you to disappear, that takes extraordinary courage." Thea leaned her head on his shoulder. "I'm scared. So am I. But I would rather face that fear with you than live without you in safety." They sat together in silence for a while, watching the city lights flicker below. Finally, Thea asked, "What happens after you repeal the decree, assuming it works?" "Then music returns to my court, art, literature, all the things we have denied ourselves, and I would very much like you to be the first to sing in our halls in 80 years. "Me, in front of your entire court? You have the voice for it, and it would be fitting. You are the reason the decree is being challenged. You should be there when it falls." "I'd be terrified. I would be beside you. What if they hate me? What if I prove them right that humans are a weakness?" Alaric turned to look at her, his expression serious. "Then they will have to go through me to touch you, and I promise you, Thea, that is not a fight they would win." The protective intensity in his voice sent a shiver through her. She realized, not for the first time, that Alaric Kovac was not just a vampire king. He was a predator, ancient and powerful, and he had chosen to bare his teeth in her defense. It should have frightened her. Instead, it made her feel safer than she ever had in her life. "I love you," she said quietly. It was the first time either of them had said it. Alaric went very still. "You do not have to say that because—" "I'm not saying it because of anything. I'm saying it because it's true. I love you, Alaric. I think I've loved you since the night you first spoke to me." He cupped her face in his hands, his touch gentle despite his strength. "I have loved you since the 10th night I listened to you sing. I did not have a word for it then, but I knew that something in me had changed irrevocably." He kissed her with a tenderness that made her chest ache. When they pulled apart, Thea was smiling despite her fears. 2 weeks, she said. "We can handle 2 weeks." But 2 weeks turned out to be much harder than either of them anticipated. The council, sensing Alaric's intentions, began making moves. Small things at first. Requests for his presence at tedious administrative meetings that kept him occupied for hours. Sudden crises that required his immediate attention. Alaric saw through the manipulation, but couldn't ignore genuine court business, which meant his time with Thea became increasingly limited. Some nights he could only stay for an hour. Some nights he didn't come at all, sending messages through a trusted vampire lieutenant named Victor, who'd been in Alaric's service for 2 centuries and had his complete confidence. Thea tried to be understanding, but the loneliness crept back in. At work, she was still invisible. At school, still overlooked. The rooftop had been her escape, and Alaric had made it magical. Without him there consistently, it felt like she was slipping back into the void. She started questioning everything. Why would a vampire king really love her? She was nobody. Maybe this was all some kind of elaborate game. Maybe he'd lose interest once the novelty wore off. Maybe the council's interference was his excuse to pull away gracefully. The doubts grew until, one night when Alaric finally made it to the rooftop after 3 days away, Thea confronted him. "Are you having second thoughts? About us?" Alaric looked genuinely shocked. "What? No, why would you think that?" "Because you're never here anymore. Because your council is clearly trying to keep us apart and it's working." "Thea, I have been managing an increasingly hostile political situation while trying to keep you safe and prepare for the decree's repeal. My absence is not by choice. Maybe it should be. Maybe this is all too complicated. Maybe I'm not worth the trouble." "Stop." His voice was firm. "I know what your mind does to you, how it tells you that you are not enough, but I will not allow you to apply that logic to us. You are worth every moment of trouble, every political battle, every hour I spend away from you only makes me more certain of that." "How can you be sure?" "Because in 600 years I have never felt about anyone the way I feel about you. Because when I'm in tedious council meetings being lectured about tradition and purity, all I can think about is getting back to this rooftop, to you. You are not a complication, Thea. You are the point." The certainty in his voice broke through her doubts. Thea felt tears prick her eyes. "I'm sorry. I just miss you. And I'm scared. I miss you too. Every moment I am away from you." He pulled her into his arms and she tucked her face against his chest. "I know I am asking you to be patient while I navigate a situation that should not be your burden, but I promise you, in 2 days, this will be resolved. The council session is in 2 days. After that, everything changes. What if it goes badly? It will not. I will not allow it. You can't control everything. Watch me." There was something almost frightening in his confidence. Thea pulled back to look at him. "What are you planning?" "To do what I should have done 80 years ago, stand my ground." The night of the council session arrived. Alaric had asked Thea to stay away, to remain safe in her apartment until he sent word. She'd agreed, though the waiting was torture. She sat on her worn couch, trying to focus on a textbook for her communications class, but the words blurred together. It was nearly midnight. The session would be starting soon. Somewhere beneath the city, Alaric was walking into a room full of vampires who saw her as a threat. She gave up on studying and went to the rooftop. She couldn't just sit in her apartment. Even if Alaric wasn't there, singing might calm her nerves. The rooftop was cold, the November wind cutting through her jacket. Thea sat on the ledge and began to sing. Not a sad song. Not tonight. Tonight she sang something defiant. A song about refusing to be silenced. Far below, in the council chamber, Alaric stood before the 12 elders once more. "Nota fur. I have called this formal session to announce my decision regarding the mortal arts decree enacted 80 years ago," he said, his voice carrying through the stone room. "Effective immediately, the decree is repealed. Music, art, literature, and all forms of mortal creative expression are no longer forbidden within our court." The chamber exploded with voices. Cassius rose from his seat, his face twisted with fury. "You have no right. The council approved that decree, and I, as king, have the authority to repeal it. You seem to have forgotten that the council serves an advisory role. You do not command me." "This is about the human girl," Morgana said coldly. "You would overturn 80 years of law for a mortal you barely know." "I would overturn 80 years of bad law because it was always wrong. The girl simply helped me see that." "She has made you weak. She has made me remember what strength truly means, and I will not debate this further. The decree is repealed. If any of you wish to challenge that decision, you may do so formally, but know that I will not bend on this." Cassius stepped forward, his ancient power radiating from him like cold fire. "Then you leave us no choice. We invoke the right of contestation. We challenge your fitness to rule." The room went silent. A challenge to a king's fitness was the gravest move the council could make. It hadn't been invoked in over 2 centuries. Alaric met Cassius's gaze without flinching. You invoke contestation over a decree about music? You would risk destabilizing the entire territory over art. We invoke it because you have proven you can be manipulated by mortals, that you will sacrifice our laws for personal desire. That makes you unfit. Very well. Alaric's voice was ice. Then let us settle this according to the old ways. You challenge my fitness, I defend it. Combat or debate, your choice. Combat would be beneath us both. We will present our cases before the full court, 3 nights from now. Let all vampires of the Eastern Territories hear the evidence and decide whether you are fit to continue ruling. Agreed. 3 nights. And when I prove my fitness, this council will accept the decree's repeal without further challenge. And when you fail, you will step down and allow new leadership to restore order. The terms were set. Alaric left the chamber and immediately sent Victor to Thea with a message explaining what had happened. Then he began preparing for the fight of his political life. When Victor arrived at Thea's rooftop, she was still singing. The vampire lieutenant waited until she finished before clearing his throat. Thea jumped, startled. "Who are you?" "Victor. I serve King Alaric. He asked me to deliver a message." Thea's heart hammered. "Is he okay?" "For now. But the situation has escalated. The council has challenged his fitness to rule. There will be a formal hearing in 3 nights. He wanted you to know. They're trying to remove him from power because of the decree? Because of you, more precisely. They see you as a weakness." "I am a weakness." Thea felt sick. "I'm going to cost him everything." On the contrary, Victor's expression was serious. "I have served King Alaric for 200 years. I have never seen him more focused, more certain of his purpose. You have not weakened him. You have reminded him why he fights. What happens in 3 days? He presents his case for why the decree should be repealed and why he is fit to continue ruling. The council presents their counter-argument. Then the full court votes. Can I be there? Alaric specifically asked that you stay away. It could be dangerous. Vampires who oppose him might target you to prove their point. I don't care. If they're putting him on trial because of me, I should be there." Victor studied her for a moment. "I can see why he loves you. You have spine. Will you take me to the hearing?" "That decision is above my authority, but I will relay your request to the king." When Alaric received Victor's message that Thea wanted to attend the hearing, his first instinct was absolute refusal. But then he reconsidered. The hearing was about whether mortal art had value, whether his connection to Thea made him weak or strong. Perhaps having her there, letting the court see what he was fighting for, would strengthen his case rather than weaken it. He sent word back. She could come, but she would remain under Victor's protection at all times, and if any vampire made a move toward her, she would be removed immediately. The 3 days until the hearing felt endless. Alaric spent his time preparing arguments, consulting with the few council members who supported him, and working to ensure that the vampires who would attend the hearing understood what was truly at stake. Thea spent the time terrified. She went to work, went to classes, functioned on autopilot. At night, she sang on the rooftop, and Alaric joined her when he could steal away. They didn't talk much, just held each other and took comfort in the contact. "Whatever happens," Alaric told her the night before the hearing, "know that loving you has been the most worthwhile thing I have done in 6 centuries. Don't talk like you're going to lose. I do not intend to lose, but I want you to know, regardless of the outcome, that you changed my life. You gave me purpose again. You gave me a voice. You made me feel like I matter. You have always mattered. The world was simply too foolish to see it." The night of the hearing arrived. Victor came to collect Thea at 11. She'd dressed carefully, choosing the nicest clothes she owned, a simple black dress and her grandmother's pearl necklace. She wanted to look worthy of a vampire king, even though she knew that was impossible. Victor led her through the city to an entrance she'd never noticed before, hidden in the basement of an abandoned warehouse. They descended stairs that seemed to go down forever, spiraling deep into the earth. The air grew colder, and Thea could hear the echo of voices ahead. The chamber Victor brought her to was massive, carved from stone and lit by hundreds of candles. Vampires filled the space, easily 200 of them, all turned to look when she entered. The attention made her want to disappear. "Stay close to me," Victor murmured. "Do not speak unless spoken to directly." He guided her to a seat near the back, positioned so she could see the front of the chamber where a raised platform held 13 chairs, 12 for the council, and one, slightly elevated, for the king. Alaric entered last, and the room fell silent. He wore formal clothing, all black, his white hair unbound and falling past his shoulders. He looked every inch the king, powerful, untouchable, ancient. His eyes scanned the crowd and found Thea. For just a moment, his expression softened. Then he climbed the platform and took his seat. Cassius stood to present the council's challenge. "Vafrai, we are gathered to determine whether King Alaric Kovac remains fit to rule the Eastern Territories. The evidence against his fitness is threefold. First, he has repealed a long-standing decree without proper consultation. Second, he has allowed personal attachment to a mortal to influence his judgment. Third, he has shown contempt for this council's authority. We submit that these actions demonstrate unfitness for leadership." Cassius spoke for nearly an hour, laying out his case. He painted Alaric as a king compromised by sentiment, weakened by mortal influence, no longer capable of the ruthless decision-making their kind required. He brought forward vampires who testified that they'd seen Alaric with Thea, that he'd been absent from court duties, that his priorities had shifted. Through it all, Alaric sat perfectly still, his expression neutral. He did not interrupt, did not argue, just listened. When Cassius finally finished, Alaric stood. "I will address these charges in order. First, the decree. Yes, I repealed it without council consultation. I did this because the decree was always wrong. 80 years ago, in the aftermath of war, this council convinced me that mortal art forms were corrupting us. I was weak from battle and allowed the law to pass. That was my failure, and I have regretted it every day since." He paused, his gaze sweeping the assembled vampires. "We have spent 8 decades denying ourselves beauty, culture, and connection to the world we inhabit. We have become isolated and cold, convinced that cutting ourselves off from mortal creativity makes us stronger. But it has done the opposite. It has made us forget why immortality is worth having. We exist but do not live. We survive but do not thrive." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Alaric continued. "Second, the charge that I have allowed mortal attachment to influence my judgment. Yes, I have formed a connection with a human. Her name is Thea Vance, and she is here tonight." All eyes turned to Thea. She fought the urge to sink into her seat. "I met her because I heard her singing on a rooftop. For 100 nights, I listened to her pour her heart into songs that no one else cared to hear. Her voice reminded me of everything we have lost. And yes, I fell in love with her. Does that compromise my judgment? The council believes so. I argue it clarifies my judgment. It reminds me that we do not rule for the sake of power alone. We rule to create a world worth living in." Alaric's voice grew stronger. "The council says I have shown contempt for their authority. I have not. I have shown contempt for bad law and cowardly tradition. There is a difference. I am king not to maintain the status quo, but to lead our people into the future. If this council cannot accept that, then perhaps the issue is not my fitness, but theirs." The chamber erupted. Vampires argued with each other, some supporting Alaric, others condemning him. Cassius called for order, and slowly the room quieted. "Eloquent words," Cassius said coldly, "but words are not evidence. You claim the mortal arts have value. Prove it. Show us something that justifies overturning 8 decades of law." Alaric turned to look at Thea. "Would you sing for us?" Thea's blood turned to ice. Every vampire in the room was staring at her, expecting her to perform, to prove she was worth the upheaval. Victor leaned close. "You do not have to do this." But Thea looked at Alaric, standing alone on that platform, defending his choices to a room full of skeptics. He believed in her. He'd staked his entire kingship on the idea that her voice mattered. She stood on shaking legs. The walk to the front of the chamber felt like miles. Vampires watched her with expressions ranging from curiosity to open hostility. She climbed the platform and stood beside Alaric, her heart hammering so hard she was sure every vampire in the room could hear it. "What should I sing?" she whispered. "Whatever you want. Just be yourself." Thea closed her eyes, took a breath, and began to sing. She chose the lullaby her grandmother used to hum. The first song she'd sung the night Alaric revealed himself. Her voice shook at first, nerves making it unsteady. But as she lost herself in the melody, the fear faded. She sang the way she sang on the rooftop, honest, vulnerable, true. The chamber was silent except for her voice. Vampires who had lived for centuries listened to a mortal girl sing a simple lullaby, and something in the room shifted. Some of them remembered opera houses and concert halls and the beauty they'd once treasured, remembered what it felt like to be moved by art. When Thea finished, the silence stretched. Then, slowly, a few vampires began to clap. Then more. Within moments, half the chamber was applauding. Cassius looked shaken. He'd expected her to fail, to prove his point about mortal mediocrity. Instead, she'd reminded them of exactly what Alaric claimed, that they'd lost something precious. "A pretty song," Cassius said, trying to recover. "But one performance does not justify. It justifies everything." Alaric's voice cut him off. "For 80 years we have denied ourselves this, the beauty, the emotion, the connection. And for what? Pride? Fear? We have been cowards, hiding behind laws that make us smaller. I will not do it anymore. The decree is repealed, and if this court votes to remove me for that decision, so be it. But I will not apologize for choosing beauty over emptiness." The vote was called. Each vampire in the chamber cast their decision: support the king or support the challenge. Thea stood beside Alaric, holding his hand as the votes were counted. It was close, terrifyingly close. But in the end, Alaric won. Not by a landslide, but by enough. He remained king. The decree was repealed, and Thea became, in that moment, the first mortal to sing in a vampire court in 80 years. As the chamber began to empty, vampires approached Alaric to pledge their continued loyalty. Some approached Thea, introducing themselves, expressing appreciation for her performance. It was overwhelming and strange and wonderful. Victor appeared at her side. "You did well. Better than well." I was terrified. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is acting despite it. When the crowd finally thinned, Alaric led Thea out of the chamber and through a series of corridors to his private quarters. The rooms were elegant, filled with books and art that he'd collected over centuries, but kept hidden since the decree. "You were extraordinary," he said, pulling her into his arms. "You changed minds tonight, changed hearts." "I just sang." "You did far more than that. You showed them what we've been missing, reminded them why beauty matters." Thea rested her head against his chest. "What happens now?" "Now we rebuild. Art returns to the court, music, literature, all of it. And you, if you are willing, will be part of that." "What do you mean?" Alaric pulled back to look at her. "I want you to perform regularly, to teach if you would like, to help bring music back to a culture that has forgotten it. And more than that, I want you to stay with me, not just for midnight meetings on a rooftop, but truly. I want you in my life permanently. Alaric, I'm mortal. You're immortal. Eventually I'm going to grow old and die. Unless you choose not to." The implication hung between them. Thea's breath caught. "You're asking me to become a vampire?" "I am asking if you would consider it. Not now. Not until you are absolutely certain. But someday, if you wanted to stay with me forever, the option exists." "That's a huge decision. Which is why I'm not asking you to make it tonight. I am simply telling you that I want a future with you, however long that future is, whatever form it takes." Thea thought about her life, the coffee shop where no one saw her, the classes where professors didn't know her name, the empty apartment and the lonely nights. Then she thought about Alaric, about singing in his court, about being part of something that mattered, about being loved so completely that a vampire king would challenge his own counsel for her. "I want a future with you too," she said, "and maybe someday I'll be ready to make it permanent, but for now, can we just be together? Figure things out as we go?" "We can do anything you want." Over the following months, Thea's life transformed. She quit her job at the coffee shop and began working with Alaric's court, helping to establish a music program. Vampires who had hidden instruments for decades brought them out. Musicians who had been silenced began to play again. Thea taught voice lessons to vampires who wanted to relearn how to appreciate music, and in turn, they taught her about their history and culture. She moved into the court, into rooms adjacent to Alaric's. The council, defeated in their challenge, began to accept her presence. Some even grew to appreciate her. Cassius remained cold, but he no longer actively opposed her. Alaric changed too. The weight that had pressed down on him for 80 years seemed to lift. He smiled more, laughed occasionally, allowed himself to enjoy the music that once again filled his halls. Thea still climbed to her rooftop sometimes, on nights when she needed to feel the city air and remember where she'd come from. Alaric always joined her. They'd sit on the ledge, looking out over the city, and she'd sing the way she used to just for him, just for herself. One year after the night they'd met, Alaric asked her again about turning. They were in his study, surrounded by books. Thea had been reading aloud to him, something they did often now. She closed the book and looked at him. "Are you sure you want this?" she asked. "Forever is a long time. I've already lived 600 years. The only thing that would make the next 600 worthwhile is sharing them with you. I'm still just me, still the girl everyone ignored. You are the woman who changed my entire world, who brought music back to my people, who loves me not because of my power or position, but because of who I am beneath all that. You are everything, Thea. And if you would let me, I would spend eternity proving that to you." Thea thought about it, about living forever, about never aging, about walking through centuries at Alaric's side. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. "Yes," she said finally, "I want this. I want you. Forever." The turning was performed 2 weeks later in a private ceremony with only Victor present as witness. It was painful. Alaric had warned her it would be, but he held her through all of it, whispering reassurances, promising it would pass. When she woke 3 days later, the world looked different, sharper, more vivid. She could hear Alaric's breathing from across the room, could smell the old paper of his books, could sense the heartbeats of humans walking on the street far above. "How do you feel?" Alaric asked, appearing beside her instantly. "Powerful, strange, hungry." He smiled. "The hunger we can address. But first, there is something I want to show you." He led her through the corridors to the main hall. The space had been transformed since she'd first seen it. Where once there were only stone and shadows, now there were tapestries, paintings, musical instruments mounted on walls, and in the center of the hall, a stage. Vampires filled the space, hundreds of them, all waiting. "What is this?" Thea asked. "Your first true performance. The 100 silent nights are over. Now you sing for a hall full of listeners." Thea's nerves fluttered, but they were different now. Not the paralyzing fear of being ignored or dismissed, just the normal nervousness of a performer before a show. She walked to the stage and stood in the center, looked out at the sea of pale faces, at vampires who had lived for centuries and had come to hear her sing. At Alaric, standing in the front, looking at her with such love and pride, it made her chest ache. She opened her mouth and began to sing. Her voice was stronger now, richer, able to hold notes she could never quite reach as a human. The song soared through the hall, and every vampire listened. Not because they had to, not because she was their king's lover, but because her voice was beautiful, and they had been starved for beauty for too long. When she finished, the applause was thunderous. Vampires called for more, and she sang again and again. She performed for 2 hours, and no one left. They stayed, transfixed, as music filled their halls for the first time in 80 years. Later, when the crowd had dispersed and Thea stood alone with Alaric in the empty hall, she said, "I never thought my life would turn out like this." "Neither did I, but I am grateful beyond measure that it did." "Do you ever regret it? Challenging the council for me?" "Never, not for a single moment." Thea looked around the hall, at the instruments and art, at the stage where she'd just performed. "I was invisible my whole life, and now I'm part of something that matters." "You always mattered. The world simply failed to see it. I will spend eternity making sure you never forget your worth." She kissed him, pouring every ounce of gratitude and love and joy into it. When they pulled apart, she was smiling. "So what now? What do we do with forever?" "Anything we want. Everything we want. We build a court that values beauty and art. We make sure music never disappears again. We live, fully and completely, in a way I'd forgotten was possible. Together. Always together. They left the hall hand in hand and climbed the stairs to the surface, found their way to Thea's old rooftop, the place where everything had started. The city spread out below them, unchanged and indifferent. But they were different, transformed. Thea sang one more song, the lullaby her grandmother had taught her, the first song Alaric had ever heard her perform. Her voice carried across the rooftops, no longer disappearing into the void but landing somewhere precious, landing with him. When she finished, Alaric said, "Thank you for 100 nights of listening to you sing alone, and for all the nights to come when you will never be alone again. Thank you for hearing me when no one else did, for seeing me when I was invisible. You were never invisible to me. From the very first note, you were everything." They stood together on that rooftop as dawn threatened the horizon. In a few minutes they would retreat underground, back to the court, to the life they were building together. But for now, they existed in this moment, in the space between night and day, between the girl she had been and the woman she had become. Thea Vance, who had spent her whole life being ignored, was now beloved by a vampire king. She had brought music back to a culture that had forgotten it. She had found her voice, and in doing so, had helped Alaric find his purpose again. 100 nights of silence had led to an eternity of song, and as the first light of dawn touched the sky, Thea knew with absolute certainty that she had made the right choice. This life, this love, this forever, it was exactly where she belonged. The rooftop remained, a monument to where they'd started. Sometimes, even years later, they would return to it. Thea would sing, and Alaric would listen, just as he had for those 100 nights. But now they listened to each other, built a life together, created a court where art flourished and love was celebrated. The girl everyone ignored became the voice that changed everything, and the vampire king who had listened in silence became the partner who would champion her for all eternity. Together, they proved that sometimes the most extraordinary love stories begin with a simple song, sung alone at midnight, heard by someone who understood its worth. They descended from the rooftop as the sun rose, ready to face forever together, and the city continued on, never knowing that one of its lonely rooftops had become the birthplace of a love that would last through the ages.